"Stop, you can't cut that power line, stop, stop." She looked up at me from the utility shed bolt cutters already biting into the wire like it was a ribbon at a ribbon cutting, and she smiled like she'd won something. The lights went out in my grandfather's house at 2 a.m. His oxygen machine went silent 20 feet away, and the backup battery started its death countdown. I can still hear that little electronic beep in my head, the one that says time is running out. You know that sound? Try not to memorize it. My name is Marcus. I've been an electrician for 12 years. I learned my trade in the Air Force, rewiring things that scream when they die. And I came home to take care of the only family left to me, my grandfather Ezra. He raised me after my parents died. He's a Korean War vet, a Purple Heart. The kind of man who still stands when the anthem plays, even though his knees complain like old machinery. A few weeks before this, he came home from the VA on oxygen, fragile as a paper boat. I moved into the little ranch in Willowbrook Heights so I could keep him breathing. We turned his bedroom into a recovery room, hospital-grade concentrator, backup tanks, the whole setup. The smell of medical tubing mixed with his Old Spice became as normal as morning coffee. I was building a life around the hum of that machine strap, and that hum became our soundtrack. And then we elected a new HOA president named Karen. Karen liked rules the way some people like power tools too much. She had this ruler-straight haircut and carried a tablet like it was a law book. At first it was small stuff, $47 here for non-approved landscaping, a $93 note about truck noise at 5 a.m., things I could laugh off. But the edge sharpened quick. Then she started photographing my grandfather through the bedroom window, labeling his concentrator industrial equipment storage. She called his suppliers unauthorized commercial activity. She wrote slideshows telling our neighbors we'd turned my house into a medical facility. I mean, who does that? If you'd seen her march around my yard, tape measure in hand, you'd think she was auditioning for a movie called Local Tyrant. She stacked the HOA board with her supporters, found a nervous city zoning guy who didn't want trouble, and suddenly 12 residents sat in a fluorescent-lit room debating whether my grandfather deserved to breathe. I stood up with federal guidelines tucked under my arm, the Fair Housing Act, reasonable accommodations for disabilities, and watched confidence crack on her face for a second. But she had a plan document: fine, escalate, force out the elderly, flip the houses to make money. A real estate play disguised as neighborhood activism. Nasty. Calculated. Here's where it turns. You want a twist? Fine. She was doing it for money. A local property investment firm was buying houses below market value when families capitulated. Karen would manufacture an unsafe living environment, pressure people out, and the firm would swoop in with a helpful offer. It's ugly, and I ought to be less surprised by human greed, but I wasn't, because this was personal. I started recording everything. Security cameras, witness statements, printed court cases, neighbor affidavits, paperwork that would make your head swim if you had to read it after midnight. Mrs. Patterson, next door, retired nurse, cinnamon roll queen, showed me videos of Karen trespassing at odd hours, flashlights, and tape measure inches from windows where oxygen tubing glowed like very small constellations. Mr. Kowalski handed me audio where Karen coached board members: make the power cut look accidental. Don't leave a paper trail. That, my friend, is the sound of a conspiracy. Then Karen crossed a line no civilized person should cross. She mailed an emergency electrical hazard notice saying my grandfather's concentrator posed a fire risk and scheduled an inspection with a clause that in her mind allowed utilities to be disconnected immediately. She convinced 2 terrified board members to sign off. I read the letter at 3 a.m. on a job site. I said no way. She decided otherwise. While I was 30 minutes away on an emergency hospital job, my phone lit up, my grandfather panicking. Marcus, the power's out. The battery's counting down. I drove like a man who'd promised to come back, broke every speed limit the law lets you break when someone you love is dying, and arrived to find Karen and 2 board members standing by a utility panel, bolt cutters on the ground like gardening tools. They'd cut the feed to my house and left the rest of the street untouched. I ripped the wires back together the way I know how hands steady, even though my insides were not. Paramedics arrived before I could finish. Neighbors had called. Mrs. Patterson checked his sat, said call 911, and they started manual ventilation. It was chaos, sirens, smell of ozone from cut insulation, and Karen standing there explaining why she'd protected the neighborhood. That was the moment everything shifted because the paramedic supervisor turned to her and said the words that would become the soundtrack to her undoing. Intentional sabotage of life support equipment is a federal crime. I'm reporting this. See, Karen had been sloppy. Not sloppy in a quaint way, sloppy with recorded evidence. Mr. Kowalski's phone had caught Karen saying, "Make it look accidental," and she'd been caught coaching others, and I had security footage of her trespassing. Then, like the last card in a terrible hand, I found something buried in the house deeds. The original developer had included a perpetual medical easement on our property. It gave priority to life-sustaining equipment and emergency infrastructure, period. That clause erased Karen's little kingdom and handed me a legal sledgehammer. And so I set a trap that was both elegant and loud. If Karen wanted to weaponize the neighborhood's utilities, I would legalize something that made her life a nightmare: hospital-grade backup power on our street, federally protected as medical infrastructure. I called a rental company and booked the biggest generator they had, the kind that hospitals use during disasters. 50 kilowatts, a 53-foot truck, a machine that sounds like a small thunderstorm. Delivery required emergency vehicle permits under our easement permits that trump HOA whining. We organized. Mrs. Patterson rallied neighbors. Mr. Kowalski's DVR became a courthouse of evidence. Mrs. Garcia, a survivor of Karen's prior harassment in a different town, drove up with court judgments, showing a pattern, the same scheme, the same playbook. We built a coalition, and we built a legal case, HUD complaints, federal civil rights filings, and a restraining order. We did every boring, meticulous thing that becomes fierce when it matters. The morning the generator arrived, the neighborhood looked like a disaster movie set. Diesel stank the air, the engine rumbled, and emergency strobes painted everything in red and blue. Karen arrived at her inspection clipboard primed to gloat and froze. The truck blocked her driveway, blocked access to the utility shed, and legally could stay as long as necessary to protect a life-sustaining device. The machine drowned out her neat suburban silence with industrial thunder, and she couldn't touch it. A local news crew showed up because someone tipped them off. Cameras like hungry eyes. An FBI agent showed up because tampering with medical equipment brings federal interest. Karen's confident little face collapsed when she was faced with audio of her plotting videos of trespass court records from another county and a federal agent's badge. She resigned the next day. We won the obvious way. Federal settlement money funded reparations for those she'd driven out the property, investment firms' practices were investigated, and the community voted to enshrine medical protections into the covenant so no HOA president could weaponize regulations again. I was elected HOA president not because I wanted the title, but because someone had to rewrite the rules that nearly killed my grandfather. But the real victory was quieter. Ezra's breathing steadied. The hum that used to make me nervous now sounded like normal life. Mrs. Patterson used part of her settlement to build a community garden with wheelchair access. Mr. Kowalski upgraded his security system and runs a neighborhood watch focused on protecting vulnerable residents. We started a small fund to help neighbors get backup power and legal help if they face harassment. The rental generator, it became a legend. People still laugh when they picture that massive truck parked in our narrow street like a peacekeeper. Here's the thing I want you to take away, and I mean this without sounding like a pamphlet. Systems meant to protect us, rules, covenants, committees can be turned into weapons by someone with little conscience and a lot of ambition. But laws exist for a reason, and communities can push back when they choose to gather facts instead of gossip. The lesson I learned was less legalese and more human. Don't underestimate the small, steady courage of a neighbor who will show up at 2 a.m. and hold a flashlight while you reconnect wires. Don't let dignity be negotiated away by fear or greed. And if someone tries to tell you the rules are absolute, remember that rights, especially when they concern life-saving equipment, trump petty rules every time. Justice didn't feel like a headline to me. It felt like my grandfather sleeping through the night without the sound of a battery ticking down. It felt like Mrs. Garcia getting her day in court after years of being told she was a nuisance. It felt like the neighborhood learning that protecting the vulnerable makes the whole place richer. Our property values went up, ironically, because people wanted to live in a place that would protect their parents, their kids, their weird uncle with a lung condition. So here's my question for you. Have you ever seen an ordinary rule used to hurt someone who couldn't fight back? Tell me what you would have done or what you did. If you've got a story like this, share it. Because the best thing that came out of our fight was a network of people who learned to stand up together. If you were here with me, I'd hand you a piece of paper with the HUD hotline and the number for our local legal aid. But since you're not, do the next best thing, leave a comment with your experience, your outrage, or your advice. Tell someone you trust about the people in your neighborhood who might be vulnerable. And if you know an HOA rule being used as a weapon, document it. Record it. Bring another neighbor. We won because we stopped whispering and started collecting evidence and showed up with a generator loud enough to wake a city. So yeah, Karen thought she could cut a wire and change lives. She tried to silence a veteran and instead lit a fire under a whole neighborhood. That power she thought she had, it backfired. Justice showed up not with a gavel at first, but with diesel and federal paperwork in a neighborhood that decided to be brave. Now when I walk past Ezra's chair and hear that soft, steady hum, it doesn't make me worry anymore, just gratitude. What would you have done? Share your story. Tell me if we did the right thing or if there was a better way. I want to hear it because these are the fights that matter, and maybe someone reading this will know what to do before the bolt cutters come out.